I want to talk about violence in a day where there's a lot of violence and there's going to be a lot more violence. We could see a draft come back to the United States. I could see my sons go to war. There's a lot at stake. For 2,000 years, Christians have wrestled with a deceptively simple question. Can a follower of Jesus kill? The debate has produced two dominant answers. The first, just war theory, says yes. The second, pacifism, says no. Both have deep roots in church history. Both have serious problems. And in our current moment, both have failed us. So I want to talk about an alternative. Howdy, guys. Welcome to my podcast. All right, this is the Jeremy Pryor podcast. The reason why I called it that was just because I wanted a place where I could tease out current things I'm working through and do this in a way that it's like not connected to some of the other projects. So I'd have family teams where we talk about how to restore the biblical blueprint of family. We have 1,000 houses where we're talking about how to activate households to disciple the city. These are the movements that I really spend most of my time building content for. But there are times where I need to tease out new ideas I'm working through and would love to get feedback on. And if you are in for that, please hang out with me here on this podcast. This is what I'm doing here. I'm saying that because sometimes I get responses from people that are like, whoa, I don't like this, Jeremy. Just got an email like that from something I posted on this podcast. And I'm like, you have to understand, like, yeah, this is what you're signing up for a little bit when you're here. I'm not talking about things that are directly related to some of these other elements, or I'm just still in the midst of working things through. And I want to talk about violence, and I want to talk about the challenge of trying to figure out what do I believe about what it means to follow Jesus with regards to the question of just war theory, pacifism, and this endless debate. And I have been on both sides of this. I've talked and debated this with many people for decades. I'm very interested in this question. And I think that in a day where there's a lot of violence and there's going to be a lot more violence, we could see a draft come back to the United States. I can see my sons go to war. There's a lot at stake. And I really want to talk about what I believe theologically about this topic. Okay. So I'm going to be publishing this on my Substack. So if you want to get into this essay that I'm about to read to you guys and interact with, you can go to my Substack at Jeremy Pryor Substack. This is Missionalism, an alternative to Christian violence. And so I'm going to walk through this carefully with you guys. And again, I'm here. I really want to get feedback. If you want to push back on this, I would love to hear your arguments. So for 2,000 years, Christians have wrestled with a deceptively simple question. Can a follower of Jesus kill? The debate has produced two dominant answers. The first, just war theory, says yes under limited, carefully defined circumstances. The second, pacifism, says no under any circumstance whatsoever. Both have deep roots in church history. Both have serious problems. And in our current moment, both have failed us. So I want to talk about an alternative to these two. I don't find myself resonating with either of them. I want to talk about why. Today we find ourselves in the strange and troubling position where Christians are often among the loudest voices for violence, while secular atheists argue for peace. Something has gone profoundly wrong. This essay argues that the confusion is rooted in a case of mistaken identity. Christians have forgotten who they are and what they are for. The solution is not a more refined just war theory, nor a more committed pacifism. It is something older and more radical, something I'm going to refer to in this essay as missionalism. Okay, so I'm going to kind of present another way of viewing the topic of violence that to me resonates much more with what I'm reading in the New Testament. I just want to say, I do find this incredibly weird and troubling, right? That if you are for state-sanctioned violence, you are kind of likely to be more conservative and more Christian in our culture. There's something flipping and happening here, and I find it really disturbing. This is one of the reasons why I really need to get into this, because I'm concerned that we are following a Christian religion, like a form of Christianity that emerged after the Bible, and not becoming radical followers of Jesus. Jesus had a very strange way of talking about this topic. And that's very challenging and hard to deal with. So I wanted to talk through these two positions and their failures. This is the reason why I don't believe in either just war theory or pacifism. Just war theory was given its most influential formulation by Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine argued that under certain limited circumstances, when the cause is just, when the authority is legitimate, and the intention is right, Christians may participate in state violence. War on this account is a tragic necessity, a lesser evil in service of a greater good. But Augustine's framework was not developed in a theological vacuum. It was developed in a political one. This is one of the reasons why I am not for this theory. By Augustine's era, Christianity has become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Church and state have fused. The question, can Christians kill, was no longer abstract. It was the question of whether the Christian empire could defend itself. Okay, so this is the very odd position that Augustine was in. I don't believe we are any longer in, and that we need to push back on because we don't have to deal with the question the same way he did. Okay, in this context, some theological accommodation to state violence was almost inevitable. The just war tradition whatever its internal merits, was born in a moment of political pressure, not prophetic clarity. You see a transition. A lot of people aren't aware of this, that the church was actually unified against state-sanctioned violence until this happened, right? So if you read the writers of the early church, the first 2 centuries of the church, there wasn't really any confusion on this topic. It really came later because of what happened when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. It created this sort of political problem. The magisterial Reformation of the 16th century repeated this pattern. Calvin, Luther, and the mainstream reformers retained the vision of a Christian society in which church and state worked together. The sword remained in Christian hands. The question was not whether Christians should wield it, but when and how. So one of the frustrating elements of what happened during the Reformation was you had Luther and Calvin, they still had the same vision, sort of this magisterial vision, this fusion of church and state that they believed in. Now, if you believe in that, if you believe that what really needs to happen is the church needs to become more and more political and take over the state, things like Christian nationalism, you're going to really have a hard time with what I'm about to say. That's not the vision I believe. I think most Christians, most Protestants don't necessarily believe that. They believe in what I'm going to describe, but they haven't really thought about the implications of that belief on the topic of state-sanctioned violence. Okay, what about pacifism? What's my beef with pacifism? The radical reformers, the Anabaptists, took a different path. They rejected the magisterial vision. They believed the church was called to be a distinct society, a separate people, not a religious arm of the state. On the question of violence, many of them drew a clear line. Followers of Jesus do not kill. This was a braver, and I will argue a more scripturally faithful position than just war theory, but it carried its own deformities. Over time, many Anabaptist communities traded not only the sword, but the mission. The Mennonites, the Amish, many of their theological descendants became defined not by their aggressive pursuit of peace through the gospel, but by their withdrawal from the world. They stopped going to war. They also, in many cases, stopped evangelizing. Passivity toward violence became passivity towards everything. Everything meaning like our real goal to be salt and light. And you'll see that in many of these pacifist traditions. A tradition that should have been marked by courageous missionary advance became associated with quiet, bounded inward communities that do not even believe in sharing their faith with their neighbors. This is not a solution. This is a different kind of failure. So it's really hard to go to the current faithful Anabaptist traditions because so many of them are anti-evangelism. And this is why I cannot stand the label pacifism. I think the church is the opposite of passive. We need to be extraordinarily active. Like we have a world-conquering mandate given to us by Jesus to disciple the nations. So I don't ever want to agree to a label like pacifism. I think that frames it in entirely the wrong way. But when you look at some of these Anabaptist traditions, it's actually a good word for what they're doing because they're not just being passive when it comes to violence. They're being passive when it comes to the world-dominating command given to us by Jesus to go and disciple the nations. Okay, so we can't be passive in the face of that. So, all right, the next section, the ecclesia, a parallel government. To find our way through, we need to recover something the early church understood with great clarity, what Jesus was actually building. When Jesus said, I will build my ecclesia, right? That's what the word church in Greek is, ecclesia. His first century audience heard a political word. Ecclesia was not primarily a religious term. It was a governmental one. It referred to the assembly of citizens responsible for governing a city. Jesus was announcing the formation of a parallel government, a new society organized around his lordship that would exist alongside and ultimately outlast every earthly empire. It's so important. Because we've lost the definition of the word ecclesia, and we've replaced it with this word church, which etymologically comes from the word Kirk, a German word that means building. This is what so confused me about why Jesus would talk about a kingdom and Paul would talk about a church. I'm like, what happened? Nothing happened. Jesus was talking about a kingdom and Paul was talking about a kingdom. The word ecclesia was a kingdom word, and we have to recapture that to even understand the argument I'm about to make. The early church took this seriously. They had their own elders, distinct from the city elders. They had their own judiciary. Paul explicitly instructs believers not to take disputes to secular courts, but to resolve them within the community. They had their own economy. They cared for the poor, their own patterns of family and household. They were, in every meaningful sense, a government within a government. But did this parallel government include its own army, its own police force? Here, the early church was unanimous. No. And the reason is found in a subtle but important shift in Paul's letter to the Romans. We're going to need to get into Romans 13 because Romans 13 is extremely important. You have to have a proper understanding of the ecclesia to understand Paul's argument in Romans 13. All right, through Romans 12, Paul addresses his readers directly. You overcome evil with good. You feed your enemies. You live peacefully with all. Then in Romans 13, the pronouns shift. This is extremely important to notice. Suddenly, Paul is speaking in the third person about governing authorities. They bear the sword. They are God's servants for justice. Paul is not saying Christians should wield the sword. He is saying Christians should honor those who do. The state has a legitimate and God-ordained role in restraining violence. Christians should respect that role, but it's not their role. It's so important to see that pronoun shift that happened between Romans 12 and Romans 13. The early church required those entering the community of disciples to leave positions that require them to commit violence on behalf of the state. Do you know that? It's really important to understand that you have the New Testament, and the way that the early church universally interpreted the New Testament is that if you became a Christian and went through discipleship, you went through what they called the catechumenate. When you were going through that process, the first 200 years of church history, you had to leave a position that required you to wield the sword. And this was not a violation of Romans 13. They saw that as their responsibility. We're a different kind of people. We are aliens and strangers. We're part of a different kingdom. Okay, so the early church required those entering the community of disciples to leave positions that required them to commit violence on behalf of the state. They were not passive about this. They understood themselves to be a different kind of actor in history, not soldiers, but ambassadors. And the passage they returned to again and again, the vision that animated their imagination, was Isaiah 2, the day when the nations would stream to the mountain of the Lord, when swords would be beaten into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, when nation would no longer train for war. They believed they were the movement through which that world was being born. Isaiah 2, according to this incredible book called The Patient Firmament of the Early Church, Isaiah 2 was the most memorized part of the entire Old Testament in the first 200 years of church history. They were obsessed with a particular vision, a vision where Christianity, as it begins to make more Jesus followers and this disciple-making movement would cover the entire earth because of Jesus' authority, this is what was going to put an end to war. And they were so excited about this that they were able to lay down violence on their own behalf. This is what they did. Okay, so missionalism, an alternative. So let me tease out exactly what I'm advocating for here. Hey, it's Jeremy. When April and I started our family, we had love, but no framework. Everyone was pulling in different directions. Then we discovered God's design for the household, a multi-generational team on mission. That changed everything, our rhythms, our purpose, even how we worked and rested. That's why we wrote a free course called 5 Days to Transform Your Family into a Team. It's 5 short emails with one simple step each day to help you realign your home to God's blueprint. You can sign up for free at familyteams.com/transform. Okay, what we need is not just war theory revised. What we need is not pacifism deepened. What we need is a recovery of missionary identity, what I'm going to call missionalism. Missionalism begins with a simple but revolutionary premise. Every follower of Jesus is a citizen of heaven first, a citizen of their earthly nation second. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of a real political reality. We belong to a kingdom that transcends every national boundary, every ethnic identity, and every political alignment. We are, as Peter says, aliens and strangers. We are missionaries in every country we inhabit, including our own. This changes everything about how we think about violence. When a war breaks out, our missionalism does not ask first which side is just. It asks first, where did we fail? Because every war is at some level evidence of the failure of the church. Violence erupts where the gospel has not gone, where the church has been passive in the face of gathering darkness, and where we are so busy arguing about when Christians can kill that we forget to bring peace that makes killing unnecessary. Okay, let me deal with the biggest argument against this that is usually, like, what would you have done during World War II? And so let me dive into how I think about World War II. Consider World War II the example most often cited as the clearest case for just war. Surely the argument goes, if any war was just, it was war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Perhaps, but consider what missionalism would have seen decades earlier. Japan was among the least Christianized, industrialized nations on earth. Germany's church had been largely hollowed out by the liberal theology of the 19th century. These were not surprises. They were visible, predictable crises. A missional church would have seen the danger and flooded those nations with the gospel. We did not, and so the bombs fell. Okay, so what I am advocating for is, if we are missionaries, then what we need to do is we need to map the earth. And if you care about violence, if you're worried about the fact that we are not going to wield the sword on our own behalf, therefore we need to be defended, there are a couple things I think that are completely appropriate to do. I think making alliances with the government is totally appropriate. That's exactly what Paul is advocating in Romans 13, to honor the fact that they wield the sword for a reason. But the more important posture for the church is to be salt and light, to go to the places where there is most likely to be violence and to bring the gospel there before the violence breaks out, before the bullets start flying. This is not to say those who fought on the right side of this conflict deserve no honor. They do. Missionalism does not despise the police force or the soldier who restrains violence and protects the innocent. Romans 13 is clear That work is God ordained, but it's not our work. Honoring those who wield the sword is not the same as picking it up ourselves. So that's kind of the position I'm advocating for here. In the same way, if you were a priest, if you saw a priest in the middle of a war, dressed like a priest, looks like a Roman Catholic priest or an Orthodox priest, you would be really surprised if you saw them suddenly pick up a gun. You would say, look, whoa, pastor, whoa, priest. Like that's not your job. Like you need to put that down. You're here for a different calling. Same thing with chaplains. My dad was a chaplain for over 30 years in the U.S. Army. And as he was a chaplain, he always had somebody, a guy called a chaplain's assistant, who was armed, who was protecting him at all times. The reason why he had that was so that he didn't have to pick up a weapon, because he has a different role in the Army. He was a chaplain. He was there to encourage the troops. He was there for peace. And I think that all Christians, and this should not be too controversial, Peter says we are all priests. That's you. You're the one wearing the priest outfit. You're the one who needs to be recognized as the missionary. You're the one who belongs to a different kingdom and has a different role in this conflict. And your role is not to pick up a weapon. Your role is to spread the gospel so that the violence can calm down. And that could even mean going to the enemy and spreading the gospel in that country, going to places where there might even be a hot war. Like, we need to really think about what we're called to do. We are called to lay down our lives, not to take other people's lives. So we need to really wrestle with the tension there. So the missionary posture in practice, what does missionalism actually look like in the face of violence? It looks like presence, not withdrawal. When violence is gathering, when a region is being radicalized, when a nation is moving toward conflict, the missionary response is to go toward that place with the gospel, not to wait until the situation resolves itself. Gaza did not become a center of violence overnight. Decades before the bombs fell, it was possible to see the trajectory. The question of the church was never primarily whose side are you on, but how do we get the gospel into that place while there is still time? When you look at what's going on in Gaza, it's really tempting to just have this endless debate about, oh, well, the Israelis, the Palestinians. Christians need to take a big step back and say, look, you guys have to understand that there were decades when the Israelis actually had jurisdiction in Gaza, and we could have flooded that place with the gospel then. It would have been dangerous, it would have been difficult, but we could have done it. We didn't do it. Then when Hamas began to take over, it got a lot more difficult, a lot more violent. There are still churches. There were Orthodox churches up and down in Gaza. There's lots of different footholds and places from which we could have tried to operate with the gospel, and there were some brave priests and missionaries who attempted to do this, but it was very difficult at that time. But that's our job, including to Israel itself, right? We need to be constantly spreading the gospel in each of these places. We're the salt of the earth. When you see violence break out between two countries, that's a report of we've failed. And could we have seen that coming? And could we have collectively been working towards a missionary activity towards those countries? Again, it's not about passivity. It's about being extraordinarily active when we have a season of open doors, but there are seasons when the doors close and it becomes much more difficult. It looks like discipling nations, not just individuals. The goal of missionalism is not simply to save individual souls out of violent societies, but to transform the cultures themselves. A discipled nation does not need to be conquered. It does not need to be bombed into peace. It is being reshaped from within by a different set of loyalties, a different imagination, a different vision of what human beings are for. It also acknowledges a collective action problem. And I want to tease this out, because sometimes you might look at this and say, well, what happens if we disciple America and then just nobody wants to join the military anymore? Nobody wants to be a police officer anymore. And now we just are flooded with violence and everybody is being the victim of more violence. Is that not inevitable with missionalism? Okay, so it says, if the church successfully disciples one nation into laying down its arms, believes that nation's enemies untouched, it has created a dangerous vulnerability. The answer is not to pick the sword back up. It is to redouble the mission to the hostile nation. Nuclear treaties work in the same way because both parties must disarm together simultaneously. The missionary vision works the same way. We are called to disciple the nations, plural, and we cannot abandon half the task. In other words, if you start to, and people have asked me this all the time, what are you saying? If we don't flood the government, the political system, and all of these positions of violence, then aren't we abdicating something that's going to cause us to have less influence? And so again, we need to be really careful that if this started to happen, then part of what we need to do is say, okay, if America became a little bit more vulnerable, and again, I think we should always honor people, even Christians. I'm perfectly fine honoring a Christian who wants to be a police officer or a soldier if they disagree with me, okay? But if I could, somehow export my position to all Christians, of course I would. I believe it's what the Bible is describing, but I know that's not going to happen. I know that most people, or a large number of people, are going to disagree with me. And so if somehow a society completely adopted a position like this, then I would say we should pay a lot of money to people who are not believers in the police force, honor them well, people that are in the political realm. But we are a parallel kingdom. And that part of what we need to do is be sending more and more people to the other countries. This is the basic mission. This is what had to happen in Israel. They were collectively just too much in Jerusalem, and the Holy Spirit was like, get out, like get to the other nations. And so this allows us to disarm together and begin to see this Isaiah 2, Micah 4 vision where we no longer train for war. This has to happen simultaneously, the same way that we sign nuclear arms treaties. Okay. So we live in a moment when the primary cultural divide in many Western nations is between conservatives and progressives. Christians have largely aligned themselves with the conservative side of that divide. Conservatives, by definition, want to conserve something, values, way of life, national identity. And when conservation becomes the primary Christian instinct, it becomes very easy to find Christians promoting violence and atheists promoting peace. You guys have to understand how weird that is and how unfortunate that is. That costs us so much on the missional side. We need to be very, very careful when we're promoting violence as Christians. This is not a coincidence. It is the predictable result of Christians who have forgotten that they are missionaries first. When national identity becomes primary, protecting the nation becomes the highest good, and violence in service of that protection becomes not just permissible, but virtuous. The tragedy is that the very people called to be the most radical peacemakers on earth, the ones animated by the Isaiah 2 vision, the ones who believe the Messiah has come to end all wars, are instead found championing military action. The solution is not to switch political sides. It is to step out of the political binary altogether and recover the alien identity of the New Testament that the New Testament insists upon. Again, I think this is an identity issue. If you see yourself primarily as a missionary, if you were sent as a missionary, I don't think your first response would be, I think I'm really wrestling with joining the country in their war against some other country, especially if you see the country itself as being not Christian. Why would you do that? Like, stay a missionary. Like, continue to spread the gospel. You're going to save a lot more lives as a missionary than you will if you join their army and start shooting people from another country who could very well be people you're going to be missionary to next, or they're missionaries trying to reach them. Why kill them? It doesn't make any sense. All right, the conclusion here. Missionalism is not pacifism. It does not say that violence is never necessary in a fallen world. It honors the police officer and the soldier who bears the sword on behalf of justice, but it insists this is not the Christian's calling. The Christian's calling is to make those swords unnecessary, to go to the nations, to disciple them, to bring the gospel of peace to the places where violence is gathering before the bombs start to fall. Every war is a measure of our failure. Every act of violence between nations is a reminder we were not where we should have been, doing what we were called to do. The answer is that failure is not to join the violence. It is to repent of our passivity and then go. We are citizens of heaven. We are missionaries to every nation. We carry a gospel that, if believed, makes war unthinkable. That is our calling. That is our weapon. That is more powerful than anything the nations of this world have ever raised against each other. So this is just a calling. And this is, again, I am trying to figure this out. I wanted to state my position as emphatically as I can so that I could be refined by anyone out there who is willing to engage us. So thank you so much for listening to this whole thing. If you're still listening, I'd love to get your comments on the YouTube video or on my Substack when I post this essay. Let me know what you think. Let me know what your pushbacks are. Let me know what you agree with. Help me refine this position if you would. But yeah, I just wanted to put it out there. This has been growing in my heart and something that I wanted to articulate. I just think we're losing contact with our identity. We are estranged. We are parallel. We are from a different kingdom. We are all missionaries, even in our own country. We need to be Christians first. Like, sometimes, you invert this. I'm a Christian American or American Christian. Which is the adjective and which is the noun? Which one defines who I am primarily as an identity? I think we should be loyal members of our country. We should love our country. We should celebrate the good things about our country. But I do think that there's a line that we need to be careful not to cross. Obviously, everyone agrees that the line is somewhere, right? There's some things you would not, some acts of violence, some acts of deception that you would say cross a line. As a Christian, I just can't participate in that any longer. And so we got to find out where that line is exactly. And so I'm trying to like give a proposal for maybe where that line is. And I'd love to get your feedback. So thank you guys so much for listening, and let me know what you think.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.